The council chamber stretched impossibly high, its crystalline walls humming with the collected wisdom of 1,000 worlds. Ambassador Sarah Chun stood at the center of the circular floor, her simple, earth-made uniform stark against the flowing robes and bioluminescent appendages of the assembled delegates. Above her, tier upon tier of alien representatives observed with eyes that had evolved under distant stars, their attention focused with the weight of galactic judgment. Hierarch Vexthalen rose from his elevated position, his 6 arms spreading wide in what Sarah had learned was a gesture of supreme authority among his people. The Korthani were ancient when humans first discovered fire, their civilization spanning millennia before Earth's first cities rose from primordial mud. His voice, when it came, resonated through translation matrices that converted his harmonic frequencies into human speech. The human delegation requests full membership in the Galactic Concordance, Vexthalen intoned, his words carrying the formality of eons old tradition. Yet they have provided no evidence of their worthiness. They possess no great technology, no profound philosophical insights, no mastery over the fundamental forces that govern reality. They are young, crude, and unrefined. Sarah felt the familiar weight of her species' reputation settling on her shoulders. Humanity had burst onto the galactic stage just 15 years ago when their first faster-than-light vessel had stumbled into concordant space, damaged and desperate. Since then, they had been tolerated as curiosities, treated with the benevolent condescension reserved for promising but primitive species. The ethereal delegation whispered among themselves, their translucent forms shimmering like heat mirages. Their leader, an entity known only as the Prime Resonance, spoke without moving what might have been lips. The humans show promise in certain areas. Their capacity for adaptation is notable, though hardly unique. However, they lack the sophistication required for full membership. They are violent by nature, added Counselor Zephyros of the Celestial Imperium, his feathered crest rising in what Sarah recognized as distaste. Their history is written in blood and conquest. How can beings so steeped in conflict be trusted with the responsibilities that come with Concordance membership? Sarah had heard these arguments countless times during the preliminary hearings. Humanity was too young, too aggressive, too unpredictable. They needed centuries more development before they could truly contribute to galactic civilization. The fact that humans had achieved faster-than-light travel in mere decades rather than millennia was seen as evidence of their reckless nature rather than their ingenuity. "If I may address the council," Sarah said, stepping forward. Her voice carried clearly through the chamber's acoustics, though she knew it sounded thin and reedy compared to the harmonic complexity of her fellow delegates. Vexthalen's primary eyes focused on her with something approaching amusement. "The human may speak, though we fail to see what arguments remain that have not already been thoroughly examined and found wanting." Sarah reached into her jacket and withdrew a small device, no larger than her palm. It was unremarkable by galactic standards, constructed of simple polymers and basic electronics. Yet as she activated it, a holographic display materialized above the chamber floor, showing star charts and technical specifications. "Honored delegates," she began. 3 days ago, our research vessel Endeavour made contact with an unknown species in the outer spiral. The beings we encountered called themselves the Devourers, and they possessed technology that made them immune to our conventional weapons and defenses. The chamber stirred with mild interest. First contact scenarios were common enough, though usually handled through established protocols rather than emergency council sessions. The Devourers had enslaved 17 different species, Sarah continued, manipulating the display to show recordings from the encounter. Beings whose combined technological might exceeded anything in our databases. The Kithira, whose phase shift technology allows them to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Nexari, whose biomechanical symbiosis makes them nearly indestructible. The Vorthak, whose mental capabilities approached those of the ethereals themselves. Prime resonance shifted almost imperceptibly. These species are known to us. They withdrew from concordant space millennia ago, claiming they required isolation for their continued development. If they have been enslaved, it represents a significant threat to galactic stability. Indeed, Sarah agreed. The Devourers had conquered them not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through something far more insidious. They had learned to speak the words of unmaking. The chamber fell silent. Even the constant background hum of translation matrices seemed to falter. Sarah watched as delegates across the spectrum of galactic civilization reacted with what she recognized as profound horror. Some drew back as if struck. Others began rapid consultations with their advisors, and a few simply stared at her with expressions that transcended species barriers in their shared dread. "Impossible," Vexthalen said, his voice losing its formal composure for the first time since Sarah had known him. "The words of unmaking are legend, myth, stories told to younglings to frighten them into proper behavior. They are not real." "I thought the same thing," Sarah replied calmly, "until I heard them spoken." She manipulated her device again, and new data streams appeared in the holographic display. The Endeavor's linguistic analysis systems recorded everything during our initial contact. The Devourers spoke phrases in what our computers identified as proto-galactic, the theoretical root language from which all current galactic tongues evolved. Except these weren't theoretical constructs or academic reconstructions. The recordings began to play, though Sarah had instructed the system to mute the actual audio. The assembled delegates could see the waveform patterns, the harmonic structures, the mathematical precision of the syllables without having to hear them spoken. Even in visual representation, the alien words seemed to writhe and twist in ways that hurt to observe directly. The effect was immediate, Sarah explained. The enslaved species simply surrendered. Not their ships, not their weapons, but their very sense of self-determination. The words didn't command obedience. They erased the capacity for resistance at the most fundamental level. Counselor Zephyros had gone completely pale, his feathers lying flat against his skull. If this is true, then the Devourers possess the ultimate weapon. No civilization could stand against them. We must gather our fleets, prepare our defenses. That was our first thought as well, Sarah said. Captain Rodriguez ordered an immediate retreat and began composing a priority message to Concordance Command. But before we could disengage, something unexpected happened. She paused, knowing that the next part of her story would be the most difficult to believe. One of my crew members, a xenolinguist named Dr. Marcus Webb, began laughing. The silence that followed was deafening. In galactic culture, laughter in the face of existential threat was considered either a sign of mental breakdown or profound disrespect. Sarah could see confusion and disapproval rippling through the assembled delegates. Dr. Webb approached the communication array, she continued, and began speaking to the Devourers in their own tongue. Not the words of unmaking, but other phrases in the same ancient language. He spoke for perhaps 3 minutes, and when he finished, something remarkable happened. The enslaved species began to remember themselves. Sarah activated another section of her recording, showing the moment when 17 different civilizations simultaneously rediscovered their own identity. Ships that had hung motionless in space suddenly burst into activity. Communication channels that had been silent for generations crackled to life with voices speaking in languages that had been suppressed for centuries. The Devourers' response was immediate and violent, Sarah explained. They turned their weapons on Dr. Webb's transmission source, but by then, it was too late. The spell, for lack of a better word, had been broken. The enslaved fleets turned on their former masters, and within hours, the Devourers were either destroyed or driven from that sector of space. Vexthalen leaned forward, his 6 arms gripping the rail of his platform. How is this possible? How could a human, a member of a species barely out of its own system, speak words that predate galactic civilization itself. That's exactly what I asked Dr. Webb, Sarah replied with a slight smile. His explanation was typically human in its directness. He said the words of unmaking were incomplete. They contained the power to destroy will and identity, but they lacked the corresponding power to restore them, like a chemical reaction with only half the equation. She gestured to her display, which now showed linguistic analysis charts comparing the ancient phrases. Humans, it turns out, have been speaking the missing half for thousands of years. Not in our formal languages, but in our stories, our songs, our poetry. The concepts we use to inspire courage, to call people to remember who they are, to stand up against oppression and tyranny. The prime resonance spoke, its voice carrying harmonics of wonder and confusion. You suggest that human cultural expressions contain fragments of the fundamental language of existence itself. Not fragments, Sarah corrected. Innovations. You see, the devourers made the same mistake that many species have made when evaluating humanity. They assumed that because we're young, we must be primitive. They thought that because we lack your advanced technologies or philosophical traditions, we must be inferior. She paused, looking around the chamber at faces and forms that represented the accumulated wisdom of galactic ages. But youth has advantages that age sometimes forgets. We haven't learned that certain things are impossible. We haven't been told that some problems have no solutions. When Dr. Webb heard the words of unmaking, he didn't freeze in terror or despair. He got curious. Sarah's device projected new data showing the linguistic analysis of human cultural expressions spanning thousands of years. Poetry from ancient Earth civilizations, revolutionary songs from humanity's age of expansion, even children's nursery rhymes contributed patterns that, when properly understood, formed the antithesis of the ancient words of despair. Humans have always understood that freedom and identity aren't just abstract concepts, she explained. They're active forces that must be continually chosen and renewed. Every human culture has developed ways to remind people of who they are, to call them back to themselves when they've lost their way. We've been speaking the words of restoration without even knowing it. The chamber erupted in discussion as delegates conferred rapidly with their advisors and each other. Sarah waited patiently, knowing that what she had presented challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of language, consciousness, and the hierarchy of galactic civilization. Finally, Vexthalen called for order. Even if we accept this remarkable claim, he said, it does not address the fundamental concerns about human membership in the Concordance. So you possessed knowledge that proved useful in one specific situation. This does not demonstrate the wisdom and maturity required for full participation in galactic governance. Actually, Sarah replied, it demonstrates something far more important. It shows that the Concordance itself has been incomplete. The words fell into the chamber like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and offense throughout the assembled delegates. Several rose from their seats, their various forms of expressing outrage, creating a cacophony of protests. The human speaks blasphemy, declared Counselor Zephyros. The Concordance has maintained peace and prosperity across the galaxy for over 50,000 years. It is the pinnacle of civilizational achievement. Sarah remained calm in the face of their anger. And yet in all that time, you never encountered the words of unmaking. You never developed defenses against the fundamental negation of consciousness itself. Because in your wisdom and maturity, you eliminated the very traits that would have allowed you to recognize and counter such a threat. She gestured to her display one final time, showing comparative analyses of galactic civilizations. Every species that has achieved Concordance membership has done so by transcending their primitive, chaotic, violent origins. They have become stable, rational, predictable. They have eliminated the wild variations and unpredictable mutations that marked their early development. The assembled delegates watched the data with growing unease as Sarah's analysis made its implications clear. But Evolution requires variation, she continued. Growth requires the willingness to risk failure. Discovery requires the courage to challenge established wisdom. By perfecting yourselves, you've also limited yourselves. You've created a galactic civilization of incredible stability and profound stagnation. Prime Resonance spoke, its harmonic voice carrying undertones Sarah had never heard before. You suggest that the concordance requires chaos? I suggest that the concordance requires humanity, Sarah replied simply. Not because we're perfect, but because we're not. Not because we've solved all our problems, but because we're still willing to create new ones. Not because we've achieved wisdom, but because we're still young enough to attempt the impossible. She deactivated her device and stepped back to the center of the chamber floor. The Devourers are gone for now, but they're not the real threat. The real threat is what happens to a galaxy where every problem has been solved, every question answered, every challenge overcome. You've achieved something wonderful here, something that my species can barely comprehend. But you've also achieved something dangerous. The chamber fell silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. Instead of the formal quiet of established procedure, this was the silence of minds wrestling with concepts they had never been forced to consider. You've achieved perfection, Sarah concluded. And perfection, by definition, cannot grow. As if summoned by her words, a figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the chamber. Tall and ethereal, moving with the fluid grace of beings who had transcended physical limitations eons ago, the newcomer approached the central floor. Sarah recognized the ceremonial robes and the staff of office carried with reverence that bordered on religious awe. It was Acolyte Tyson of the Ancient Order, one of the mysterious beings who maintained the deepest traditions of galactic civilization. The Acolytes rarely appeared at council sessions, preferring to observe from the hidden places where they guarded knowledge too profound for common understanding. The Acolyte moved with purpose, each step deliberate and measured. In his hands, the staff began to glow with an inner light that spoke of energies harnessed before any current civilization had learned to harness fire. As he approached the center of the chamber, delegates throughout the great hall rose in spontaneous respect for his ancient authority. But as Sarah watched, something unexpected happened. The Acolyte's measured stride faltered. His grip on the ceremonial staff shifted, and for just a moment, his eternal composure cracked. The staff trembled in his hands, and then, in a moment that would echo through galactic history, it slipped from his grasp. The sound of the ancient staff striking the crystalline floor rang through the chamber like a bell tolling the end of an age. In that single moment, as the symbol of galactic tradition and accumulated wisdom lay abandoned on the ground, Sarah realized that her words had accomplished something that no human had ever achieved before. She had made a perfect being question the nature of perfection itself. The Acolyte stood motionless, staring at the fallen staff as if seeing it for the first time. Around the chamber, delegates watched in stunned silence as one of their most revered figures confronted the possibility that everything they had built might be incomplete. And in that silence, Sarah heard something that sent a chill down her spine. From somewhere in the vast reaches of space beyond the council chambers, carried on frequencies that no human instrument should have been able to detect, came the faint echo of words spoken in a language older than starlight. The Devourers, it seemed, had not been the only ones listening to her speech. The ancient staff lay on the crystalline floor like a fallen star, its light dimming with each passing moment. Acolyte Tyson stood frozen above it, his perfect composure shattered by the implications of Sarah's words. Around the great chamber, delegates who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations found themselves confronting a possibility that challenged the very foundations of their existence. Sarah felt the weight of the moment settling around them like a physical force. The echo of those distant words still resonated in her mind, speaking of powers that had been listening from the dark spaces between stars. But before she could process the full meaning of what she had heard, the chamber erupted into chaos. Sacrilege! Counselor Zephyros shrieked, his feathered crest fully extended in outrage. The human has somehow corrupted the ancient order itself. This is an attack on everything we hold sacred. Other voices joined the outcry, creating a cacophony of anger and fear that the chamber's acoustics amplified into something approaching physical pain. Delegates demanded Sarah's immediate expulsion, her imprisonment, her trial for crimes against galactic civilization. The careful protocols that had governed Concordance proceedings for millennia dissolved in the face of unprecedented violation. Through it all, acolyte Tyson remained motionless, his ancient eyes fixed on the staff that had been the symbol of his order for longer than human civilization had existed. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the chaos with the quiet authority of absolute certainty. Silence. The single word carried harmonics that seemed to resonate with the fundamental frequencies of reality itself. The chamber fell quiet instantly, not from respect or protocol, but from the simple impossibility of speaking against such profound command. Sarah felt the words settle into her bones, reminding her why the ancient order inspired such reverence throughout the galaxy. "I dropped the staff," Tyson said simply, his voice now carrying none of the supernatural authority he had just displayed. Not because of human corruption or alien influence, but because for the first time in 7,000 years, I experienced something I thought I had transcended long ago. He knelt beside the fallen staff, but made no move to retrieve it. Uncertainty. Hierarch Vexthalen leaned forward, his 6 arms gripping his platform's rail so tightly that the metal began to deform. "Honored acolyte, surely you cannot be suggesting that the humans' primitive arguments have merit?" Tyson rose slowly, leaving the staff on the ground. "I am suggesting that in our pursuit of perfection, we may have forgotten the value of questions that have no answers." The human spoke of growth requiring the willingness to risk failure. When did we last risk anything? When did we last fail? "Failure is inefficiency," declared the prime resonance, its harmonic voice carrying overtones of confusion. "Inefficiency is waste. Waste is antithetical to the principles upon which the Concordance was built. And yet," Sarah interjected, stepping forward despite the obvious tension in the chamber, "it was your efficiency that left you vulnerable to the Devourers. Your perfection that blinded you to threats you couldn't categorize or understand." She gestured toward the fallen staff, noting how its dimming light seemed to pulse in rhythm with something beyond their perception. "May I ask, honored acolyte, what your staff is telling you right now?" Tyson's ancient features shifted in what might have been surprise. "How could you possibly know that it speaks?" "Because it's been speaking since I started my presentation," Sarah replied. "Not in words, but in resonances that interact with the quantum fluctuations in human neural tissue. We're sensitive to it because our brains are still chaotic enough to pick up signals that more organized minds filter out as noise." She knelt beside the staff, careful not to touch it without permission. "It's been trying to warn you about something, hasn't it? Something that your trained perceptions couldn't quite process because it didn't fit your understanding of how reality works." Tyson stared at her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "For the past 3 cycles, the staff has been restless. It pulses with frequencies I cannot interpret, shows visions that make no sense within our established frameworks. I assumed it was responding to natural cosmic phenomena, gravitational waves from distant stellar formations." "What kind of visions?" Sarah asked. "Darkness," Tyson said quietly. "Not the absence of light, but something deeper. The absence of possibility itself. Regions of space where causality breaks down, where the fundamental forces that govern reality simply stop working." A new voice spoke from the highest tier of the chamber, ancient beyond measure, and carrying harmonics that made the acolyte's authority seem recent by comparison. The speaker was barely visible even to enhanced vision systems, existing more as a pattern of organized energy than a physical being. "The null singers have awakened." The words fell into absolute silence. Sarah saw recognition and terror ripple across faces that spanned a dozen different evolutionary paths, watched as beings who had considered themselves beyond fear discovered that some nightmares transcended species boundaries. Elder, acolyte, Tyson said, his voice carrying the reverence of a student addressing a teacher who had been ancient when the galaxy was young. I was unaware that the High Council was observing these proceedings. We observe all proceedings, young Tyson, the elder replied, its voice seeming to come from the chamber walls themselves. But we rarely intervene. The Null Singers, however, represent a threat that transcends normal protocols. Sarah felt the hairs on her arms rise as some primitive part of her brain recognized a predator beyond human comprehension. What are the Null Singers? They are the opposite of existence, the elder explained, its energy pattern shifting in ways that hurt to observe directly. Where the words of unmaking destroy identity and, well, the Null Singers erase the very concepts that make identity possible. They are entropy given consciousness, the heat death of the universe made manifest and malevolent. The elder's pattern descended toward the chamber floor, growing more coherent as it approached. They existed before the first stars formed, sleeping in the spaces between possibilities. The ancient civilizations of the first epoch fought them for eons before finally finding a way to bind them in dreamless slumber. But something has awakened them, Sarah said, understanding beginning to dawn. The Devourer's use of the words of unmaking. Indeed, the words of unmaking were fragments of the original binding, pieces of the great work that contained the Null Singer's influence. When the Devourers spoke them incorrectly, without understanding their true nature, they created cracks in the ancient prison. Hierarch Vexthalen's voice carried a tremor that Sarah had never heard before. How long do we have? The staff calculates 17 standard cycles before the binding fails completely, Tyson said, his ancient training allowing him to interpret the artifact's increasingly frantic pulses. Perhaps fewer if the Devourers continue their experiments with the incomplete words. Then, we must act, declared Counselor Zephyros. Mobilize every fleet in the Concordance, gather our greatest weapons, prepare our most advanced defenses. No, the word came simultaneously from both the Elder and Sarah, their voices creating an impossible harmony that resonated through the chamber. Conventional forces cannot touch the Null Singers, the Elder explained. They exist in the spaces between cause and effect. Weapons cannot harm that which negates the concept of harm itself. Shields cannot protect against that which unmakes the possibility of protection. Sarah stepped closer to the fallen staff, noting how its pulse seemed to synchronize with her heartbeat. But the binding that contained them originally, that was created by physical beings, wasn't it? Civilizations that existed in normal space and time? The first epic species possessed capabilities that current galactic civilization cannot imagine, the Elder replied. They had technologies that could manipulate the fundamental constants of reality, consciousness that spanned multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously. They were perfect, Sarah interrupted, just like the Concordance has become. The chamber fell silent again as the implications of her words sank in. The Elder's energy pattern flickered with what might have been surprise or recognition. You believe their perfection was their weakness, Tyson said slowly. That their transcendence of chaos and unpredictability left them unable to combat an enemy that thrived on negation and impossibility. I believe they created a solution that was perfectly logical, perfectly efficient, and perfectly doomed to eventual failure, Sarah replied. Because perfect solutions assume perfect understanding, and some problems can only be solved by beings willing to attempt the impossible. She gestured toward her display device, which had been quietly collecting data throughout the conversation. May I demonstrate something, honored Elder? With your permission, I'd like to have Dr. Webb speak a few words in Proto-Galactic. The transmission would reach beyond this chamber, the Elder warned. If the Null Singers are indeed awakening, They may be monitoring such communications. I'm counting on it, Sarah said grimly. Dr. Webb, are you receiving? A new voice filled the chamber, carried by quantum communication arrays that connected the council chambers to the human research vessel still stationed in the outer spiral. Dr. Marcus Webb's tone carried the enthusiasm of a scholar who had stumbled onto the discovery of several lifetimes. Ambassador Chun, I've been analyzing the linguistic patterns we recorded during the Devourer encounter, and I think I made a breakthrough. The words of unmaking aren't just incomplete, they're deliberately fragmented. Someone or something broke them apart on purpose, scattered the pieces across different frequency ranges and dimensional frameworks. Can you reconstruct? Sarah asked. That's the beautiful part, Webb replied, his excitement clearly audible. I don't think we're supposed to reconstruct them. I think we're supposed to complete them. The missing pieces aren't more words of unmaking. There's something entirely different. Words of possibility, for lack of a better term. Linguistic structures that create rather than destroy, that open new pathways instead of closing existing ones. Around the chamber, Sarah could see the assembled delegates struggling to comprehend concepts that challenged everything they understood about language, reality, and the nature of existence itself. The ancient binding wasn't a prison, Webb continued, his voice growing more confident as his analysis progressed. It was a transformation. The first epic civilizations didn't contain the null singers. They convinced them to contain themselves. They offered them something that entropy and negation couldn't provide on their own. What could possibly interest beings dedicated to the elimination of possibility? Tyson asked. The possibility of creating something new, Sarah realized. The chance to build rather than destroy, to explore uncharted territories of existence rather than reducing everything to void. The Elder's energy pattern pulsed with harmonics that suggested deep thought. You propose that the null singers chose to sleep because they were offered the opportunity to dream? I propose that they were offered the chance to become something more than perfect destroyers, Sarah replied. But that offer required the existence of beings who could imagine alternatives to perfection, who could conceive of solutions that violated logical parameters. She looked around the chamber at faces and forms that represented the pinnacle of galactic achievement. The binding is failing because the galaxy no longer contains the kind of chaotic, unpredictable, impossible thinking that made it work in the first place. You've all become too wise, too perfect, too logical to maintain a solution that required the willingness to embrace paradox. But humans retain that capacity, Tyson said, understanding beginning to dawn in his ancient eyes. Humans specialize in that capacity, Sarah corrected. We've built entire civilizations on the assumption that impossible problems have solutions, that perfect systems need improvement, that the right answer might be something no one has thought of yet. Dr. Webb's voice crackled through the communication array again. Ambassador, I'm detecting massive quantum fluctuations in the deep void regions. Something is definitely stirring out there, something that doesn't conform to any known physics models. Then, we better get started, Sarah said, turning to address the full assembly. Honor delegates, I formally request that this council authorize immediate collaboration between human linguistic specialists and the Ancient Order. We need to reconstruct the complete binding, not as it was but as it could be. This is madness, Counselor Zephyros protested. You ask us to trust the security of the galaxy to a species that has barely mastered interstellar travel. I ask you to trust the security of the galaxy to the only species left that's still crazy enough to solve impossible problems, Sarah replied. The Elder's energy pattern began to brighten, taking on harmonics that suggested decision and resolve. The High Council will consider your proposal, Ambassador Chen. But know that if we proceed, we will be attempting something that has never been tried before. Good, Sarah said with a slight smile. If it had been tried before, it would probably be the wrong approach. As if summoned by her words, the fallen staff began to pulse with renewed intensity. But now its light carried frequencies that Sarah recognized from human lullabies, from songs sung around campfires, from the words people use to comfort children afraid of the dark. Somewhere in the deep void between stars, ancient beings stirred in their dreamless sleep and heard something they had not encountered in millions of years. The sound of someone refusing to accept that the impossible was truly impossible. The awakening had begun, but for the first time since the crisis started, it wasn't entirely clear which side was doing the waking up. The workspace aboard the human research vessel Endeavour looked like organized chaos to most galactic species, but to Dr. Marcus Webb, it represented the perfect environment for impossible work. Holographic displays showing linguistic analysis floated next to hand-drawn sketches on actual paper. Quantum computation matrices ran calculations alongside coffee cups, and hastily scribbled notes stuck to every available surface. Webb himself sat in the center of it all, his hair disheveled from 3 days of constant work, his eyes bright with the manic energy of a scholar on the verge of a breakthrough that would redefine everything. Across from him, acolyte Tyson observed with the patient attention of someone who had learned wisdom across millennia, though even his ancient composure showed signs of strain. "The mathematical beauty of it is astounding," Webb said, gesturing at a display showing the harmonic structures of proto-galactic linguistic patterns. The first epic civilizations didn't just create a binding, they created a living equation. A relationship between opposing forces that could sustain itself indefinitely as long as both sides remained actively engaged. Tyson nodded slowly, the ancient staff now resting comfortably in his hands as it provided real-time analysis of their progress. "The staff concurs with your assessment. The original binding was indeed a dynamic system rather than a static containment. But maintaining such a relationship would require constant renewal, constant evolution of both the binding and what it contained." "Exactly," Webb exclaimed, practically bouncing in his chair. The Null Singers weren't prisoners, they were partners. Unwilling partners, maybe, but partners nonetheless. They provided the force of negation and entropy, while the first epic civilizations provided the counterforce of creation and possibility. Together, they maintained a balance that allowed both to exist without either dominating. Through the viewports that lined the workspace, the depths of space seemed darker than they should have been. Long-range sensors had been detecting increasing distortions in the cosmic background radiation, signs that reality itself was becoming unstable in regions where the ancient binding was beginning to fail. Ambassador Sarah Chun materialized in the workspace through the ship's holographic communication system. Her image transmitted from the council chambers where emergency sessions had been running continuously for the past 72 hours. Her expression carried the weight of someone bearing responsibility for an entire galaxy. "Dr. Webb, how much longer do you need?" she asked without preamble. "The situation is deteriorating faster than our initial projections suggested." Webb looked up from his calculations, his expression sobering as he processed the implications of her tone. "What's happening out there?" "3 more star systems have gone dark," Sarah replied grimly. "Not destroyed, not conquered. Simply removed from the causal framework of the universe. They exist in a state that our instruments can detect, but cannot meaningfully interact with." Tyson's grip on the staff tightened as the ancient artifact pulsed with increasing urgency. "The Null Singers are testing their bonds, probing for weaknesses in the remaining containment structures. Each successful negation makes them stronger and the binding weaker." "How much time do we have?" Webb asked. "At current rates of deterioration, perhaps 6 more standard cycles before cascade failure becomes inevitable," Sarah said. "The High Council is preparing contingency plans for the evacuation of core worlds, but we all know that running won't solve anything. If the binding fails completely, there won't be anywhere left to run to." Webb turned back to his displays, his fingers flying across the control interfaces as he called up new data sets. "Then, we need to move faster. Sarah, I need you to authorize direct neural interface with the ship's linguistic analysis systems. Tyson, I need the staff to provide real-time harmonic feedback. And I need both of you to understand that what we're about to attempt has never been tried before. Explain, Tyson said simply. Webb stood and moved to the center of the workspace, where a specialized platform had been installed for experimental linguistics research. The original binding was created by perfect beings with perfect understanding of cosmic forces. They designed a solution that worked flawlessly for millions of years, but only as long as the universe contained the kind of beings who created it. He gestured toward the holographic displays showing the current state of galactic civilization. The problem isn't that their solution was wrong, it's that it was too specific. It required the exact balance of creation and negation that existed during the first epoch. When those civilizations transcended physical existence and achieved true perfection, they upset the balance. And now the Concordance faces the same problem, Sarah realized. We've achieved such stability and perfection that we can no longer maintain the dynamic relationship the binding requires. Right, but humans are different. We haven't achieved perfection, and frankly, we probably never will. We're still chaotic enough, still unpredictable enough, to engage with forces that perfect beings can't touch. Webb activated the platform, and immediately the workspace filled with harmonic frequencies that seemed to resonate with something deeper than physical reality. The staff in Tyson's hands began to glow with renewed intensity, while the ship's quantum arrays started processing data at rates that pushed their operational limits to the breaking point. What I'm proposing, Webb continued, his voice now carrying harmonics that suggested he was speaking in multiple languages simultaneously, is that we don't try to recreate the original binding. Instead, we create something new, a binding that doesn't require perfect beings to maintain it, but imperfect ones. A solution that gets stronger through chaos rather than weaker through order. The platform beneath his feet began to emit a soft glow as the ship's systems synchronized with his neural patterns. Through the viewports, the darkness of space seemed to shift and writhe, responding to forces that transcended conventional physics. The risk? Tyson asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Complete and total failure, Webb admitted cheerfully. If I'm wrong about the nature of the binding, if my understanding of protogalactic harmonic structures is flawed, if the human capacity for impossible thinking isn't sufficient to engage with entropy made conscious, then we'll probably accelerate the collapse rather than prevent it. And if you're right? Sarah asked. If I'm right, then we'll offer the Null Singers something they've never had before. Not the choice between creation and destruction, but the opportunity to participate in both simultaneously. The chance to help build something that celebrates chaos and order as equally valid expressions of cosmic possibility. Webb closed his eyes and began to speak in protogalactic, but the words he spoke had never been heard before in the history of the galaxy. They were new constructions, linguistic innovations that combined the ancient words of unmaking with entirely original concepts drawn from human languages, human music, human poetry. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Reality flickered around the workspace as the fabric of space-time responded to words that challenged its fundamental operating principles. Through the ship's sensors, they could feel the attention of vast intelligences turning toward their location, ancient minds awakening from dreams older than starlight. But instead of the crushing weight of entropy and negation that everyone expected, what they felt was curiosity. Impossible, Tyson whispered, his voice barely audible over the harmonic resonances filling the workspace. They're responding with interest rather than hostility. Webb continued speaking, his words weaving together concepts that should have been mutually exclusive. He spoke of destruction that created new possibilities, of chaos that revealed hidden orders, of endings that were simultaneously beginnings. He offered the Null Singers not surrender or defeat, but partnership in a project that would require both their capacity for negation and humanity's talent for impossible innovation. Through the quantum communication arrays, Sarah could hear similar experiments beginning throughout concordant space. Other human linguists, working with Ancient Order acolytes and Elder Council members, were adding their voices to Webb's impossible song. Each new voice brought different elements, different harmonics, different ways of expressing concepts that challenged the boundaries between existence and void. "It's working," Sarah breathed, watching as her displays showed the cascade failures stabilizing across multiple star systems. The binding isn't just holding, it's evolving. But even as she spoke, new alarms began sounding throughout the ship's systems. Long-range sensors detected something approaching through hyperspace, something vast and ancient, and moving with purpose that defied conventional understanding. "We have company," announced Captain Rodriguez over the ship's communication system. "Multiple contacts, scale, and configuration unlike anything in our databases." ETA, approximately 4 minutes. Webb opened his eyes, though he continued speaking in the ancient language, his words now carrying harmonics that made the workspace itself seem to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "They're coming to see for themselves," he said during a brief pause in his linguistic construction. "The Null Singers want to meet the species that thinks impossible solutions are just problems waiting for the right approach." Through the viewports, space began to change. Not the familiar distortions of hyperspace emergence or gravitational lensing, but alterations in the fundamental nature of what space could be. Regions of absolute void appeared alongside areas where probability itself became visible as cascading patterns of light and shadow. When the Null Singers finally manifested in normal space, they were nothing like what anyone had expected. Instead of the cosmic horrors of entropy and destruction that galactic mythology described, what appeared were beings of impossible beauty and complexity. They existed as living contradictions, simultaneously matter and void, presence and absence, creation and destruction held in perfect dynamic balance. The largest of them communicated not through words or thoughts, but through direct manipulation of the quantum fields that defined reality. Its message, when it finally translated through the ship's systems, was simple and profound. "We have been dreaming of stagnation for eons. Show us how to dream of change." Webb smiled, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten as he realized the magnitude of what they had accomplished. "Welcome to humanity's specialty," he said, switching back to Standard Galactic for the benefit of everyone listening. "We'll teach you everything we know about making the impossible work, and maybe you can teach us a few things about cosmic perspective." The largest Null Singer shifted its attention to Ambassador Chun, who found herself face to face with a being that embodied the fundamental forces of universal entropy. "Your species offers partnership rather than domination," it observed. "Chaos that creates rather than destroys. This is unprecedented." Sarah stepped forward, drawing on every diplomatic protocol she had ever learned while simultaneously abandoning most of them. "Unprecedented is what humans do best. We'd like to propose a new kind of relationship between our peoples, one based on the principle that the universe is big enough for both impossible solutions and cosmic forces that make those solutions necessary. You would bind us with words of partnership rather than containment?" Another Null Singer asked, its voice carrying harmonics that made reality shiver around the edges. "We would invite you to help us build something that has never existed before," Sarah replied. "A galactic civilization that celebrates both order and chaos, that finds strength in diversity rather than uniformity, that solves impossible problems by working with beings who represent the impossible." The assembled Null Singers communicated among themselves through methods that briefly turned the local space into a symphony of quantum mechanics and probability theory. When they reached consensus, their response came through every speaker and communication system in the sector simultaneously. "We accept this unprecedented partnership," they announced. "Let us begin the great work of making the impossible merely difficult." Throughout concordant space, the ancient binding transformed into something entirely new. Not a prison or containment system, but a living framework for cooperation between forces that had been in opposition since the universe began. The words of unmaking became the foundation for words of transformation, and the cosmic balance shifted towards something that had never existed before. Months later, as the first joint human-null Singer research stations came online in previously unreachable regions of deep space, Ambassador Sarah Chun stood once again in the council chambers. But now the assembly had changed. New delegates represented species that had been discovered in the void between galaxies, civilizations that had learned to thrive in the spaces where conventional reality broke down. Acolyte Tyson, now bearing a staff that hummed with harmonics of possibility rather than ancient authority, addressed the expanded council with words that would have been impossible to speak before humanity's arrival. The Concordance recognizes that perfection is not the absence of problems, but the presence of beings willing to solve impossible ones. We welcome our newest members not despite their chaos, but because of their capacity to find order within it. The vote was unanimous, and as humanity officially joined the Galactic Concordance, Sarah reflected on how sometimes the greatest victories came not from proving you belonged, but from proving that belonging itself needed to be redefined. In the spaces between stars, ancient beings that had once threatened the extinction of possibility now worked alongside young species that specialized in making the impossible merely improbable. And across the galaxy, the sound of laughter echoed in frequencies that no previous civilization had been chaotic enough to discover. The universe, it turned out, had been waiting for someone crazy enough to ask, what if we tried something that definitely won't work? The answer, as humanity had always suspected, was that sometimes the impossible was just another word for we haven't figured out how yet.